How to read a timeline using the See, Think, Wonder routine. The text we'll be working with is the history of the world, a 6,000-year chronicle of time. It's an example of a timeline. Timeline is an example of a compound word. A compound word is a larger word made up of two smaller words. Some examples of compound words you are already familiar with are thunderstorm, football, and classroom. Use your word detective skills. Make a prediction about what you think a timeline is. Pause the video now and write your predictions in your notebook in your own words. Then share them with a partner. Make a prediction using the hint that the title and the subtitle supply to the readers. What period of time do you think this timeline might be about? Pause the video now and write your prediction in your notebook in your own words. Then share them with a partner. We'll be using the See, Think, Wonder routine to walk you through discovering how to use a timeline. Take a moment and pause this video. Then copy the chart you see into your notebook under the two predictions you just made. Make sure you leave yourself lots of space to write your thoughts. Gather around the timeline and move around the edges, examining it closely. What do you see? What are you noticing about our timeline? How is this text different from other texts you've used in our classroom? Write down all the things you observe under the See column in the chart you just made in your notebook. Pause the video now to do that. Let's talk about some of the things we noticed about our timeline. Most of you said, I see that the timeline is tall and very, very long. Some of you said, I see there are lots of colors on our timeline. Some of you also said, I see our timeline shows lots of things and people from the past. Many of you said, I see the colored bars are labeled with place names and some are labeled in other ways. A few of you said, I see the numbers are bigger at the ends of the timeline and smaller in the middle. And a few of you said, I see our timeline stops at the year 2000. Now, let's take some time to get you thinking about your observations that you've written in the See column of your chart. Pause the video and write down an explanation for each point in the Think column of your chart. Then share them with a partner. Let's look at some of the thinking you wrote on your chart. Many of you thought the reason our timeline is so long and so tall is because it shows lots of history. Some of you thought the reason our timeline has color has something to do with helping the readers find information more easily. Nearly all of you thought the timeline shows important people and events that have happened in history, and there's a lot of it. Some of you thought that the color on our timeline might have something to do with events and people that may be related. A few of you thought that some important person or event is marked on our timeline where the numbers would meet at what would be a 0. I bet almost all of you have heard at least something about this person or event. Some of you noticed that the timeline ended at the year 2000, and you had some thinking around that. Now, we'll examine some of your thinking a bit more deeply. The subtitle, the words after the large title words on the cover of the timeline, say a 6,000-year chronicle of time. Do you think this might be the reason our timeline is so tall and so very, very long? Some of the entries in the individual bars of color seem like they might be related. What do you think these bars of color might mean on our timeline? If we examine the first page of our timeline, we find that the colors here match up to entries on the later pages. Some of these colors also match up with a map of the world. Each region seems to have its own color. What do you think this might mean? On this same key, we also have some colors that have icons or symbols next to them. They don't seem to be associated with regions of the world. They have headings such as explorers and traders, scientists and inventors, arts and religion, and first dates. What do you think these might mean? What do the symbols or icons right next door look like to you? The first icon looks like a ship's wheel, like the one you see here. This is the type of wheel you might find when steering a ship. In centuries past, explorers and traders used ships to travel around the globe. Why do you think that the makers of this timeline used the icon of a ship's wheel to represent explorers and traders? Let's look at the next icon used for scientists and inventors. The symbol looks like a snake climbing a stick or a branch. In fact, it's a special symbol called a caduceus. A caduceus is the staff carried by Hermes, the Greek messenger god. You may remember him from your study of Greek mythology. You sometimes see the caduceus in doctors' offices, hospitals, or pharmacies, drugstores, to indicate healing, but it also represents commerce, or buying and selling things. Why do you think the caduceus is used to represent inventors and scientists? The next icon also relates to Greek mythology. Look at this icon closely. To me, it looks like the face of an owl. Do you remember the goddess of wisdom, Athena? She is often shown with an owl, her sacred animal. Why do you think the owl icon is used to represent philosophers and religions? Finally, the last symbol from our timeline is one that you may be familiar with. What does the light bulb in this picture symbolize? What do you think the light bulb icon on our timeline symbolizes, and why was it selected to represent first dates? Another thing some of you noticed is that the years listed at the top and the bottom of each of the timeline pages. Many of you saw that the numbers get smaller as you move to the left, and then they get larger again. Why do you think that happens? Let's take a moment to think and discuss why this might be so. Is there some event you think may be significant enough to cause the timeline to change at this point? This is just like a timeline in math. You haven't met negative numbers in your studies in gamma, but negative numbers are numbers that are less than zero. You may have already heard of very cold temperatures referred to as below zero, such as, it's so cold it's 10 below zero, but we don't have negative years. Instead, we call the years before the birth of Jesus BC. If we look at our timeline to see when the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx were built in ancient Egypt, we know they happened a long time before Jesus. We can look at our timeline to determine when they were built. The Great Pyramids and the Sphinx were built more than 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, in about 2350 BC. The farther back in time you go, the bigger the number gets. But these are still negative numbers, less than zero, before the birth of Christ. You can use your timeline to see what things were happening at close to the same time, what things happened before an event, and what things happened after an event. Here, we see that the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Sphinx were built before King Tut, who lived at about 1300 BC, or 1,300 years before the birth of Christ. We also see that the Chinese opened the first zoo about 600 years before King Tut lived. And about the same time the first zoo opened, we see that Near East people began to make tools using the metal bronze. Now that we know how to find out when things happened on our timeline, I want you to think of some questions you may still wonder about. and write them in the Wonder column of the chart in your notebook. Pause the video now and do that. Then share your answers and responses with friends. Here's how I responded, some of the things that I wondered about in thinking about our timeline. Keep in mind that the things you wonder about and the things I wonder about may be very different. Here are some of the things that I wondered about. First, I wondered what happened for the earliest things that are shown on our timeline. I also wonder why Eastern Europe is partnered with the Middle East rather than Western Europe with the same color. Also, I wonder if some of the people shown in one region of our timeline knew about people and events happening in other regions of the timeline. Also, I wonder if people and events shown in the icon-labeled roles, such as inventions or firsts, affected many different regions of the world, or maybe just one or two. Also, I wonder if there are any other special places on our timeline, like where BC turns into AD. Finally, I wonder which people and events would be selected for our timeline if it went up to the present day rather than just to the year 2000. What are the things that you wondered? Now, I'd like you to look back at our timeline again. Open it up and pay special attention to the years that we refer to as the Middle Ages, the years between 500 AD and 1500 AD. This period of time, the Middle Ages, will be our theme for the next several weeks.